We all think we know the story. A war fought for states' rights, a principled defense against federal overreach, a lost cause led by noble men. This is the story that was written after the guns fell silent. But what if that story was a carefully constructed myth designed to hide a much uglier truth? What if the very founding documents of the Confederacy and the actions of its most revered leaders proved that this was never about states' rights at all, but was, in fact, always about preserving one thing and one thing only: slavery? Tonight we expose the evidence they left behind. But before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel to help support our community. Advocates for Southern secession have historically portrayed the Confederacy's establishment as a principled stand for constitutional states' rights, contending that withdrawal was a response to perceived federal overreach rather than a struggle to maintain slavery. They assert that the Union endangered Southern traditions and that secessionists were safeguarding regional autonomy against Northern imposition. Admittedly, when the Southern states departed, no comprehensive federal law had been enacted to eliminate slavery, and Abraham Lincoln openly disavowed any immediate intention to free those who were enslaved. Nonetheless, Deep South leadership, with South Carolina at the forefront, considered Lincoln's 1860 electoral victory unacceptable. They opted for secession rather than acquiescing to a democratic outcome, and their formal pronouncements explicitly identified the protection of slavery as their primary objective. As further slaveholding states seceded, they formed a unified national government, the Confederate States of America. This new constitution established a federal framework, but was carefully designed to curtail state powers in significant areas. It governed taxation, consolidated monetary authority, and even restricted state control over the foreign slave trade. Most importantly, it enshrined clauses to prohibit any legislation interfering with slave ownership, banning ex post facto laws, or any acts that would weaken the property rights of slaveholders. By granting slavery federal-level safeguards, the Confederacy eliminated the possibility for individual states to outlaw or restrict the institution independently. This reality directly conflicts with the states' rights rationale, frequently cited as the war's principal motivation. It also ignores the South's earlier initiatives to restrict Northern state sovereignty. It is important to recall that invocations of sovereignty were often conditional and tactically deployed long before 1860. The roots of this cleansed account are intricate, yet it gained widespread acceptance chiefly in the post-war period. Similarly, the notion that black men served extensively as Confederate soldiers finds scant support in the historical record. On the other hand, plentiful documentation refutes this claim. The Confederate administration formally prohibited the enlistment of black individuals as standard fighting personnel, instead utilizing them, whether free or enslaved, primarily for support roles. These compulsory duties involved physical labor in the field, food preparation, transporting goods, and caring for livestock, typically conducted under the guard of armed white overseers. Enslaved individuals were also forced to work in war-related production, mining operations, railway construction, and manufacturing plants. This system of compelled labor had long been the foundation of the Southern economy, and slaveholders frequently rented out the enslaved workers, pocketing all or most of the wages earned. In rare instances, an enslaved person might receive a share of the pay, but this was not the common practice. During the conflict, Confederate lawmakers continually discussed plans to enlist black men as soldiers, but they consistently voted down these initiatives until March 1865, just weeks before General Lee's capitulation. This last-minute policy faced intense opposition. Prominent individuals such as Robert Toombs, a former Confederate Secretary of State and a vocal opponent of arming black troops, condemned the concept as destructive to Southern principles and morale. In a written piece from June 1865, he contended that incorporating black regiments into the Army of Northern Virginia would diminish its stature, despite the fact that this force had already ceased to exist. Following the initial wave of 7 states leaving the Union, the new Confederate administration in Montgomery insisted that regional militias transfer their authority to the central government. Presidential authority was extended over military command, encompassing both volunteer forces and assimilated militia units. In the early stages, both Union and Confederate armies depended significantly on volunteers to bolster their numbers and man their naval vessels. But this stream of volunteers proved inadequate for the Confederacy's escalating personnel needs. By April 1862, its leadership conceded that relying solely on voluntary service was unsustainable. That same month, they passed the first federal conscription statute in American history, establishing a draft to preserve their military's numbers. This law provoked widespread resentment. Its initial scope covered men between 18 and 35 years old, but it excused those in critical wartime professions and, significantly, individuals possessing 20 or more enslaved people. The justification was that such men were required to manage enslaved labor, an acknowledgment that the institution of slavery was considered indispensable to the war effort. By 1864, the draft's reach had grown substantially, at times encompassing those from 17 to 70 years of age. Clauses that allowed for the payment of substitutes, a practice also employed in the North, enabled affluent men to evade combat, fostering a sense of inequity based on wealth. Although volunteers continued to constitute a large portion of the fighting forces for both armies, the imposition of a draft provoked legal disputes, political friction, and public disorder. Riots against the draft in New York City and other northern municipalities demonstrated the profound unpopularity of mandatory service. The southern states experienced their own surges of defiance. Resistance to forced military service continued until the Confederate government finally disintegrated. After the first round of secessions, other southern states delayed their decision as internal debates and external pressures intensified. South Carolina, having been the first state to secede, was especially forceful. Its officials insisted that national government representatives relinquish command of military forts within their borders, most notably Fort Sumter, which was positioned at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. The defensive arrangement for Charleston Harbor consisted of Fort Sumter and its neighboring installation, Fort Moultrie, located on Sullivan's Island. In his inaugural speech on March 4, 1861, President Lincoln declared he would not launch an invasion of the seceded states nor meddle with the institution of slavery in regions where it was already established. He simultaneously affirmed the national government's obligation to gather import duties at southern harbors and to retain possession of its military forts situated within secessionist lands. Secretary of State William Seward pursued unofficial discussions with Southern representatives, aiming for a resolution without conflict, yet these attempts proved futile. Stationed in Charleston, Union Major Robert Anderson strategically relocated his command from the vulnerable Fort Moultrie to the more secure Fort Sumter. After the national administration publicized its intention to provision the fort via a naval expedition, Confederate President Jefferson Davis commanded its seizure, an action that immediately provoked armed conflict. Major Anderson declined an immediate surrender and attempted to continue discussions, but Confederate troops eventually opened a 2-day artillery assault on Fort Sumter, compelling its capitulation. The fall of this fortification, combined with the takeover of other federal installations in states like Missouri, prompted President Lincoln to issue a call for 90-day volunteers to retake the captured posts. These developments influenced a number of hesitant states, including Virginia, to reassess their stance on leaving the Union. Prior legislative tallies in Virginia had defeated motions to secede, but the escalating national emergency revived the discussion. While most states that left the Union between 1860 and 1861 were later readmitted with their original borders preserved, Virginia constituted a significant departure from this pattern. In contrast to the Deep South, where secession enjoyed more widespread popular support, Virginia's citizenry was initially resistant to abandoning the Union. This sentiment changed following the attack on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's request for military volunteers. delegates from states that had already seceded actively lobbied participants at the Virginia Convention, striving to persuade the state to join the Confederacy. President Lincoln's appeal for troops to quell the insurrection further inclined public opinion toward secession. Nevertheless, significant pro-Union sympathies remained, especially in the western mountainous regions. Delegates from these areas assembled in Wheeling and initiated a movement to break away from the rest of Virginia. By the spring of 1861, they had formed a restructured state authority that pledged allegiance to the Union, which received recognition from the federal government and dispatched 2 senators to represent its western constituencies. Consequently, Virginia operated under 2 rival administrations, one aligned with the Confederacy and the other with the Union. In May 1862, the Wheeling legislature authorized the creation of a new state from its western territories, and the U.S. Congress accepted West Virginia in 1863, stipulating that it must eliminate slavery. Virginia was thereby separated from its northwestern lands, and notably from the Arlington property, which had previously belonged to Robert E. Lee. This estate was subsequently appropriated by the federal government and established as Arlington National Cemetery. The Army of Northern Virginia, under Lee's command, undertook 2 significant incursions into Northern Territory. In 1862, following a conclusive victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee advanced into Maryland, a border slave state with divided sympathies. His objectives were to foster local support for the Confederate cause, interrupt Union operations, and provide respite for war-exhausted farms in Virginia that were straining to support Southern forces. While Maryland offered material resources, Lee's troops risked turning the population against them by confiscating provisions and apprehending black individuals they encountered during their movement. This offensive lost momentum after Lee's defeat at Antietam in September 1862. Although his army withdrew in an organized manner following the most lethal single day of combat in the nation's history, the operation yielded minimal strategic benefit. In 1863, after a triumph at Chancellorsville, Lee commenced a second invasion, this time into Pennsylvania. His aims were to secure fresh provisions, damage Northern confidence by endangering urban centers such as Washington and Baltimore, and impair the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, a target he had previously noted. Contrary to certain assertions, his primary intention was not to conduct a massive operation to enslave people, even though his soldiers did detain free and fugitive black persons during the march. Several months before, in March 1863, Confederate leadership had ordered that all apprehended black individuals, regardless of their legal status, be sent to Richmond for compulsory labor. This official directive leads some to characterize the Gettysburg Campaign as an extensive slave-gathering operation intended to bolster Confederate supply efforts. However, this interpretation conflicts with aspects of Virginia's legal and individual histories, including the personal stance of Robert E. Lee himself. In 1857, following the passing of his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, Lee's spouse came into possession of the Arlington property, additional holdings, and approximately 189 enslaved individuals. Custis's testament directed that these individuals were to be granted their liberty within a 5-year time frame. Lee, acting as the executor, was confronted with significant financial obligations. He took a temporary leave from his military duties to personally oversee Arlington, pursuing legal actions that postponed manumission. To settle debts, Lee sold enslaved people, an act that led to the separation of almost every family unit under his control, with a single family remaining together. The enslaved population resisted, demanding the liberty assured to them in the will. Lee documented the challenges of enforcing control, noting that he jailed some, contracted others to far-off employers, and posted rewards for the capture of those who escaped. He endeavored to extend their servitude for the entire 5-year term, and potentially beyond. While the claim that he personally administered a whipping is debated by scholars, Lee did permit physical discipline in certain situations. Lee characterized the institution of slavery as a more detrimental moral affliction for white civilization than for black people, and after the war he stated to a congressional panel that black people were not naturally inclined toward labor. He also voiced his desire that Virginia could remove its black population following emancipation, thereby rejecting the feasibility of genuine racial integration. So, what is the significance of these facts for our collective memory of the Civil War and the Confederacy? Was the struggle genuinely motivated by states' rights, or was that a narrative constructed afterward to conceal the South's profound legal commitment to preserving slavery? And if the Confederacy explicitly forbade any move to abolish the institution, what does that reveal about the fables still promoted in the present day? The reality is more nuanced and considerably more unsettling than many are comfortable acknowledging. So, where does this evidence leave us? We are faced with a fundamental contradiction. A nation that went to war in the name of state sovereignty, yet built a constitution that permanently forbade those states from choosing freedom. This forces us to ask a difficult question. If the core justification taught for generations crumbles under the weight of its own founding documents and the actions of its most iconic leader, what are we really remembering? The story of the Confederacy is not just a tale of battles and politics. It is a case study in how history is written and rewritten. It's a reminder that the stories we tell about our past are never just about the past. They are about who we are and who we aspire to be in the present. The evidence is now before you. The declarations, the laws, the personal letters. The decision of what to do with this history is yours. What do you think it truly means?